Well, first of all, let me join congratulations to the Institute of Institutional Studies with an anniversary, and I would like to wish to the Institute many times more by 10 times, and we will be happy to participate in the future conference workshops devoted to the next anniversaries as well. My presentation is called Labor Flows in the Russian Labor Market, and it's joint work with my colleague Anna Sharonina. It's still work in progress.
Control full screen.
Control E.
Control E.
Control
L.
L.
Sorry.
Yeah, so it's much better, yeah. So scholars of the Russian labor market, or those who are interested to some extent in how labor markets in transition countries adjust, may know that Russian labor market looks a little bit differently than in, let's say, conventionally assumed by economic theory and what observed in most of the developed countries. This non-standard or non-conventional adjustment was first marked by Richard Laird, who then wrote a paper about, and he coined this term, the Russian labor market. It was in '95. He, at the time, had very short period of observation, just from '92 to '95. What was that? This was a very strange case of adjustment when country had enormous macroeconomic shock, GDP nosedived, but employment rate remained high and unemployment was still very low. But at the same time, real wages, they went down enormously. So this was basically the model of adjustment, where the cost of adjustment was borne by a price side, not by quantitative side. But this was in early 90s. Then we had a very strong crisis in late 90s. Then we had positive shock induced by hike in petrol prices in beginning of the previous decade. Then we had crisis of 2008, 2009. Now we have new crisis, and the model is still here. The same is repeated every crisis. When the shock is positive, employment doesn't react, wages go up very strongly. When GDP goes down, employment again remains very stable, but real wages react very strongly. Now we have about 3% GDP fall. Real wages went down by 14%. So it's very, very strong reaction. So we can say that the core of the model, in terms of performance, this is very rigid or quite rigid employment, but quite flexible wages. Price adjustment dominates over quantity adjustment. And we see high employment, we see low unemployment, but surprisingly high labor turnover. And high labor turnover was also documented in a number of studies. Our point is that this is the explanation of this very strange model has to do not with special Russian soul, not with special Russian mentality, but with institutions. So there are institutions which regulate employment on the one hand and affect wages on the other hand, and they explain this particular model. What are these institutions? Their list is quite clear. These are employment protection legislation, these are minimum wage regulations, this is unemployment benefits regulation, and we can add also a few others. Most studies of the Russian labor market, they look at stocks, employment, unemployment, and measure performance of the labor market in terms of stocks, or they look at institutions, or they try to put together these two, explaining performance through the institution. But there is still one angle of viewing on the Russian labor market, on any labor market, which assumes looking at flows. Not just stocks, not just institutions, but flows. But definitely if we have particular, probably very strange adjustment in terms of performance, probably should these stocks have something strange also in flows. And this paper tries to look at flows and tries to connect institutions, performance, and flows. We know that there is fast-growing interest to labor market dynamics. And labor markets, modern labor markets, are very, very dynamic. And we can say that there is definitely a lack of studies of dynamics in the Russian labor market. We look at particularly at three major states. This is employment, this is unemployment, and inactivity. These are standard statuses on the labor market. And when we talk about the Russian labor market dynamics, we first of all mean flows from unemployment to flows connecting these three states. And changes in unemployment can be presented as a function of particular flows. Structure of the presentation of what I'm going to present further on is the structure is presented on this slide. I will talk about stylized facts, just to give you some insight on the explain data. Then I look at transition matrices. We use Shorrock's indices of mobility. We estimate dynamic multinomial logic, and finally we decompose unemployment change using data on flows. There is a number of studies looking at major economies and focusing on flows. And this is a very important feature of the labor market. Various countries, they differ in terms of intensity of flows, in terms of direction of flows, and there is great interest in explaining unemployment dynamics through changes in flows. And actually we follow this literature. Yeah. And this slide gives an idea of what happened with two major indicators, employment and unemployment. So employment increased from this to that. On the left hand, this is employment rate about 58%, and at the end we had 65%. And unemployment declined from 12% to it's half. So there is quite significant decline in unemployment. Which institution can affect flows? First of all, this is low minimum wage. Low minimum wage means that there is larger wage inequality. Larger wage inequality induces more quits and more labor turnover. So people are unhappy with low wage, they can move, and due to low minimum wage, there is huge variation in wages on the labor market, so they can look for vacancies somewhere, and this generates a chain of vacancies. Low unemployment benefits. Low unemployment benefits, they work basically in the same way, but at the same time, they create very weak incentives to stay unemployed. Because people cannot survive on unemployment benefits, it means that they have incentives to avoid unemployment, minimizing the duration of spell of jobless. Employment protection legislation. This is very important institutions, which affects the rate with which firms fire people. So if we have strict employment protection legislation, it means that the formal sector will not lay off people, so probably quits will prevail and will be quite intensive, but no layoffs. Of course, we always have poor enforcement, can also affect flows, but because this is very selective, in some parts of the economy, the flow of firings can be quite limited. In other places, will be much larger. Oops, sorry. We use RLMS data, years 2000, 2012, and I will not talk more about the data because I think all here know about that. Labor market states, how we define it. We use basically the standard definition to the extent it can be applied using RLMS data. Employed are those who had work on the months before the survey, who could be in any paid leave or non-paid leave, or were engaged in some occasional work. Unemployment, those who don't have job, who look for job, and who are ready to start new job. All the rest are inactive or non-participating in the economy. So this is basic division of all our population in age. We consider in these three groups. This slide shows major flows. These are employed, these are non-participating, inactive, and these are unemployed. And we see that very large flows are between employed and inactive, and relatively small flows are between inactivity and unemployment, between unemployment and employment. And we have data, for example, for the UK, not just for the UK, but UK in this sense is quite characteristic, and we can compare these numbers with what we have for the UK. And there is a clear contrast. So, and if you look at other countries as well, usually people who lose job, they move into unemployment, and then they can come back. Here we see that people move to inactivity, or if they move to unemployment, then they try to leave unemployment quite fast and stay inactive, and then they from inactivity come back to employment. So it's a different route compared to those which are used by individuals on the labor market in most of the countries. We can estimate intensity of the flows using Shorrock's index, so-called Shorrock's mobility index. And because there are data also for other countries, we can compare mobility in Russia in terms of as they are measured, as it's measured by Shorrock's index with mobility in other countries. And we can say that Russian mobility, mobility between these three states, is much more intensive, is much more active than in any European country for which we have data. The most dynamic labor market, according to the paper Vladimir and Machiavelli, 2013, is Denmark and Sweden. Index is about 0.5, less than 0.5. For Russia, this is higher. And we can also disaggregate by gender, by education, and we see that mobility in Russia is much more intensive than in other countries. Mobility in terms of movement, between these three states. We can we can get additional insight in what happens with mobility, estimating multinomial logic model using previous states, using the labor market states in the previous factor as like regressive, and controlling for gender, for age, for whatever we can get from the data. And then using these coefficients, because they are very difficult to interpret, we can simulate probabilities, conditional probabilities from moving from one state to another state. And what we can see here, this is matrix for men and for women, show conditional probabilities based on estimates from that regression. And we can say that probabilities of moving from employment to unemployment are very low, but movement from employment to inactivity and back are very high. And if we do this, and what we can disaggregate employed further on into three groups, dividing all employed into those who work in the public sector, into those who work in the private sector but formal private sector, and those who work in informal labor. And this slide shows that most of the mobility affecting those who are employed comes from private sector and informal sector. And public sector workers are quite immobile. So mobility in general is very intensive. Most of the mobility affecting employed comes from private sector and informal sector. So how much time left?
1 minute.
1 minute. Okay, this is the final exercise. As I said, we document very significant decline in unemployment. So the question is how we can explain change in unemployment, decline in unemployment rate through using data on flows. And here we follow the literature. There are two ways to decompose. One approach assumes that all individuals in the labor market are divided in two groups, those who are employed and those who are non-employed. Further on, we can use three states, those who are employed, unemployed, and inactive. So first we do this simpler decomposition following Fujita-Rami. We get things like this. So we have data also for UK, France, and Spain, and we see that the change in Russia, the change in unemployment is almost fully explained by by inflows. And for UK and for France and for Spain, change of unemployment coefficients are quite different, and decrease in unemployment is much less to change in inflow rate. Here we use 3 states, and again we see that employment to unemployment flows, they explain almost 50% of decline in unemployment. From inactivity to unemployment, about 40%, and movement from unemployment to employment and unemployment to inactivity, the fraction is very small compared to other countries. So we can say that the decrease in unemployment is explained largely by reduction in the inflow rate. 1/2 of decrease is due to decrease in inflow from employment. 1/3 of the total decrease in unemployment is due to decrease in the inflow from inactivity. And this is our labor market. So this is pool of unemployed. And there are 2 ways into unemployment, from employment and from inactivity. There are 2 ways out of to employment and to inactivity. We have very strict employment protection legislation. Employment protection legislation restricts this flow. We have very low unemployment benefits. Low unemployment benefits means that incentive to move into unemployment is very weak. Incentive to stay in unemployment is also very weak. It means that due to employment protection legislation, people don't come here. Those who come here, they have clear incentive to leave as soon as possible, and if they are able to find re-employment very soon, they go to employment, otherwise they go to inactivity. And they wait for job opportunity being inactive. It means they don't do active search, but as soon as they get a chance to do something for job, they grab it. It means that we have very intensive turnover with many short spells and with basically very poor matches. And one poor match generates new poor match and then new poor match. And if you look, for example, at distribution of those employed by tenure, firm-specific tenure, yeah, working in this particular, we see that the Russian average tenure is about 7-8 years compared to much longer tenures in most of the countries. If you look at the proportion of those who have tenure, firm-specific tenure, less than 1 year, in Russia is over 20%, what is much higher than in many other countries. So we have particular configuration of institutions which induces enormous labor turnover and generates enormous churning and very huge number of short tenures, short spans. And this particular institutional configuration actually tells us a lot about our labor market policy. Our labor market policy is oriented not towards helping people from here to get reemployed. To get reemployed, we need job creation, and job creation is slow. So the labor market framework has one particular target: to regulate unemployment using this step. And many administrative procedures and many administrative practices, which are in fact absurd, and they just give additional evidence for that. So thanks.
Thank you very much. We still have some 5 minutes for discussion. It was difficult to introduce the picture of the Russian labor market within 20 minutes.
So yes, as you have said, the main channel is from employment to inactive in our country. Probably it can be partly explained that informal employment as a gray zone is within inactive, right?
No, it's part of employment.
Yeah.
It's part of
So
employment.
simply people stay in inactive looking for
Yeah.
a possibility of finding some job.
Yeah, well, actually, definition of unemployment means that unemployed are those who don't have job,
Right.
who look for job, actively search job. So basically, unemployment, state of unemployment, it's job searching job, if I can say that. So and they are ready to start working. If, for example, they don't have job, they're ready to start, but they don't look actively. They are inactive. It's a definition. So it means that people lost job, they don't do anything, then someone called, look, there is some job, I don't know, to repair something, or I don't know, to give a lift using your car to someone. Then people get this and they do. And then they, again, are very, very passive because vacancies in formal sector are very limited, information about them is very limited, and this institutional mechanism works quite poorly. So, yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. I have questions regarding the definitions. So, what about the inactive? Are these also those who are long-term unemployed in Western countries? Just they rely not on the support of the state, but on the family support to support their living. And then there is an overlap, a small overlap maybe between these two groups, just depending on how we define it.
No, you see, there cannot be any overlap. Of course, all these definitions they are not ideal, but they are as they are introduced by International Labour Office, and all economists everywhere they use them, because otherwise we cannot compare countries, we cannot compare the same country all the time, and so on. If you are talking about long-term unemployment, they are unemployed. Of course, some people, when they cannot find job for a long time, they can stop looking for job, and then they become inactive. And these people are called discouraged workers. They are in activity, in non-participation. It doesn't mean that these discouraged workers, they don't want to get job. They want to get job. They do nothing to get job because they are discouraged. They tried, they invested enormous effort in that, they failed, and then they decided, okay, let my family support me. Of course, this division line, these boundaries between different states are to some extent blurry. But long-term unemployment, if you are saying long-term unemployment, they are unemployed.
I also have one question, probably one suggestion. Am I right that when we define staying employed, you do not, you simply mean that people stayed within employment, you do not count how many times they changed one job for another, or you do?
No, because you see, we observe people once a year. Of course, to look at at flows. Ideally, we need monthly data or quarterly data.
Yeah, but still even annual based.
Yeah, and if on annual based, we see people once a year, we spell 1 year, and within this year, people could change jobs many times,
Yeah,
and we, in this sense, actual mobility can be higher than the.
yeah, that's what I mean. In principle, well, then later you define this informal sector, employment sector, also public versus private. But probably even within from public to public or from private to private, this job-to-job movement is one of the key features of without unemployment. Well,
Sure,
It could be
definitely.
interesting to
Yeah, definitely.
I wanted to ask a question. So basically, I was thinking about the paradox that you are talking about. On the first hand side, you have very strict employment protection legislation that restricts, you say that mobility, okay? But on the other hand side, if even we are talking about the taking into account only the movement between employment, unemployment, and activity, you also show that there is a great movement. But if also I can draw back to your words about the tenure, that there are 20% of those who are having short tenure but with 1 year. So I just was thinking, how can you explain, on the one hand, the strictness, and so basically they manage to find new jobs, so there are vacancies. So how can you just comment on that?
No, first of all, there is quite large informal sector where there's no employment protection.
Yeah, but then you can trace only those who are in the companies, in the enterprises. So
well, no. We can, people can, for example, if you have, for example, I don't know, gardener in your dacha, and you hire someone, and these people can say, oh, okay, I do this job for this particular person for 6 months. Before that, I worked for another one. So it's still, but even in firms, because labor turnover is high, how we can explain it? It probably would take for me another presentation. Yes, it looks like a puzzle. Actually, it has clear explanation. And it takes us to the issue of how wages are set and how wage setting generates wage inequality. And wage inequality means that if I work here, my alternative wage is not just a particular point estimate, it's huge range. And it stimulates job-to-job move. If I move from here to another job, my position here becomes vacant, and it's taken by someone. So this wage setting generates wage inequality. Wage inequality generates vacancy chains, and there is enormous turnover, job-to-job moves. This is a problem, very serious problem. When we are talking, for example, on the job training, we are puzzled why Russian firms don't want to invest in training. Very simple, because I invest in training and this person tomorrow lives next door. It has many externalities, it has many implications. And then very strict employment protection means that I cannot fire workers, but I cannot easily force people to quit. So employment protection legislation doesn't doesn't limit, my ability to force people to move out. Of course, this has implications for workers and for firms, but for employers, it can be even more beneficial. They don't pay severance pay. There is actually a very interesting paper. I think it's on Canadian diet. It's called Economics of Prozac. Now, Prozac, this is antidepressant.
And the idea is that if you have protected jobs and you have non-protected jobs, and then crisis comes. And people in protected jobs are protected by the legislation, and non-protected are much more exposed to,
Vulnerable.
yeah, they are vulnerable. So what happens with those who are in protected jobs? Canadian data allow to measure consumption of antidepressants. And they show that people who are in protected jobs during crisis, they have much stronger stress than those who are in non-protected jobs, because those who are non-protected, they are ready for that. And for these are shocks. So this is just how it can go. And here you can see also people using particular wage setting mechanisms, they are forced to leave. It's very easy because we know how wages are set, there's fixed part of the wage, there's variable part of the wage, and for employers it's very easy, you know, to variable part to reduce, sending you a signal, it's time to quit. Or if you don't want to quit, you just get lower wage.
To think like the refuge and suggest that we have this reception time to continue discussion of Russian labor market. Thank you very much.